So July 13th, Monday, there was a text in the devotional this morning from Acts chapter 19, verses 21 through 41. And verses 28 through 31 kind of stood out to me. The context is Paul and some disciples are in Ephesus, and this guy Demetrius, who's a silversmith, is upset because Paul and others are leading people to Jesus and challenging their devotion to Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, wilderness, animals, moon, and chastity. And so Demetrius is upset because it's messing him with his business, because he's, as a silversmith, he makes shrines for Artemis. And in verse 26, it says that Paul was leading people astray. And so Demetrius is upset. Paul is convincing people and leading them astray. And by astray, it means away from Artemis. And so Demetrius causes this sort of big stir in the city. And in verse 28, it says, when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. So there's just a couple things that sort of stood out to me this morning. Number one, I think maybe when people think that we're being led astray, it's possible that we're actually being drawn closer to Jesus. In this case, it was, Demetrius was upset that Paul was leading people away from Artemis, but if I'm honest with myself, there are all kinds of gods in my life that are not Jesus that I need to be led astray from, And I think if we're honest, there's oftentimes that we think that we're following Jesus, and when we stop and realize, oh no, that wasn't Jesus, or I think there's this, at least I know I can think of times in my life where I've stopped and thought that I was following Jesus, and I realized I'm like, no, that really wasn't Jesus. That was more like some Christian culture that had the branding of Jesus, but it wasn't really Jesus per se. And it wasn't necessarily anti-Jesus, but it also wasn't Jesus. And so when I find myself being led further closer to Jesus and sort of walking away from that kind of living, I know there are people that had that sort of, oh, Justin's being led astray kind of a thing. And I'm like, no, I'm actually getting, I think, hopefully, I think I'm being led closer to Jesus. So I think that's just, there's something to sit with there. Are we willing to be led away from the gods of our lives that are anything or anyone other than Jesus? And along with that, and Paul, I love it in verse 30, and this makes me think of you, Paul Spute, just because you're radical. It says, Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. And I love how Paul is just going for it. And I think here there's the recognition that Paul recognizes Christ's call to death. The whole city was in an uproar. He upset the whole city. And this is a city that was in many ways, defined by its allegiance to Artemis. The temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And here he is proclaiming Jesus in the midst of that, challenging their economy, challenging their identity, challenging their god or goddess. And the whole city's upset, and he's like, let me go out there. I want to die. I'm in. Let me go proclaim Jesus, you know. And even his disciples who are learning from him are like, Paul, you can't go out there. Like, don't do it. Like, we're not going to let you. And even, you know, it continues, even some of the officials of the province, like even people who they're not necessarily disciples, but they're like leaders of this province are like, Paul, please don't do this. You can't go out there. But I think Paul recognizes Christ's call to death, and so must we. And not always a physical death. I think it's when Jesus invites us to daily take up our cross, it's not necessarily this call to, you know, a physical martyrdom, but it is the call to deny ourselves and the things that we want for the sake of following Jesus and inviting others to do the same. And here Paul was willing to really put his own life on the line, and I think that's something that we need to sit with as well. So may we be led astray from the gods who are not Jesus. May we recognize Christ's call to die to ourselves so that others may have life. And I wanted to close with the prayer from the devotional this morning. God of all grace, in foolishness and humility, we often dare to speak on your behalf, claiming to know your ways and making promises we struggle to keep. Help us learn to be still, trusting that you indeed are God. Amen.